October 1983. Elk County, Kansas. The drought had been building since June, and by October the air still carried the smell of it. Not the rich, dark smell of harvested grain, not the clean smell of coming rain, but something older and emptier, like heated stone and dried bone. The smell of ground that had given everything it had and received nothing back. Raymond Voss stood at the north edge of his property at 5:40 in the morning, one boot heel pressed into soil that should have been soft with October dew. It was not soft. It had not been soft since April. He was 63 years old and had farmed this same 160 acres since 1945. 38 years of reading that ground the way other men read clocks, with complete certainty and without needing to look twice. What he was looking at now was 110 acres of winter wheat that had come in at 5 bushels per acre. The crop had been projected at 38. Raymond had run those numbers on the back of a seed invoice in March. 38 bushels per acre across 110 acres at $3.45 per bushel. $14,210. Enough to make the January payment on the $78,000 operating loan he'd taken from Elk County Federal Savings in 1981 at 16.5% interest. A loan secured against every piece of equipment in the yard, the hog confinement building, and the farmhouse itself. Enough, barely, for one more year. He'd harvested instead $1,898 worth of wheat. The rest was straw. 90 tons of brittle, drought-killed wheat straw lay in windrows across the north field, pale yellow under the flat October sky, worth nothing to anyone. His wife Agnes had been dead since 1979. His son David was 24 and working in Wichita. The 160 acres and the debt were Raymond's alone, and the January payment was due in 93 days. He stood there long enough to watch the sky go from gray to the particular flat white that precedes a Kansas winter. Then he walked back toward the barn. If you want to see where this goes, subscribe so you don't miss the next story. Elk County Federal Savings occupied a single-story brick building on Main Street in Howard, Kansas. Dale Schrader, 31 years old, had been its assistant loan manager for 3 years. He was efficient, precise, and correct in the way that men are correct when they have never been seriously wrong about anything that mattered to anyone else. He called Raymond's number on October 14th. Raymond drove the 14 miles to Howard the following morning. Schrader's desk held a manila folder with Raymond's name on the tab. He opened it without ceremony. "Mr. Voss," he said, "your January payment is $1,104. Based on your harvest report, your cash position won't support it. We'd like to begin discussing options." Options meant one thing. Raymond knew it. Schrader knew Raymond knew it. Raymond asked about a loan modification. Schrader said the bank's current policy did not allow modifications on agricultural operating notes without 2 consecutive years of documented hardship. This was the first year of documented hardship. Raymond would need to return in 12 months. He drove home. 2 weeks later, Raymond was at Webb's Farm Supply in Howard buying auger belts when Roy Decker materialized at the counter. Roy farmed 340 acres 4 miles south of Raymond's property. He was 51, broad across the shoulders, and the kind of man who formed opinions quickly and held them publicly. Roy had heard something. Howard was a town of 1,200 people, and information moved faster than weather. "Heard you were thinking about mushrooms," Roy said. Raymond had mentioned it to no one. He said nothing. "On that dead wheat straw," Roy said. He turned a washer over in his fingers and set it back in the bin. "Dale Schrader was at the Rotary lunch yesterday. Said you'd asked him about specialty crop financing. Said you had some notion about mushrooms on straw." Roy smiled with one side of his mouth. "Raymond, I've known you 40 years. That's not farming. That's a science project." Raymond paid for his auger belts and left. He drove home in 14 minutes, turning over what he now knew. Dale Schrader had shared the contents of a private loan conversation with the Howard Rotary Club. The modification request, Raymond's crop numbers, the mushroom idea he had mentioned only in passing, all of it, described over fried chicken and mashed potatoes to anyone in that room who wanted to hear it. Raymond had $1,900 in the farm account, a payment due in 90 days, and no legal path to a loan modification for 12 more months. The man who managed his debt had publicly described his plans as a science project. He pulled into the yard and sat in the truck for a moment. Then he walked to the barn. His father Heinrich's barn held a wooden shelf nailed to the south wall above the workbench. 3 decades of agricultural notebooks stood there in Heinrich's dense, upright handwriting, pencil on composition paper, the kind of record-keeping a man does when he knows no one else will do it for him. Raymond had read most of them in the years after Heinrich died in 1961. He had not read all of them. The last one on the left was labeled 1934-1939 on the spine in barely legible pencil. Raymond took it down and sat on an overturned bucket under the single bare bulb above the workbench. The relevant pages began on page 47. Heinrich had written them in November 1936. A man named Joseph Bresny had come to Elk County in 1927 from the Moravia region of Czechoslovakia. He'd bought 12 acres and raised chickens, cabbage, and beginning in 1929, mushrooms, specifically Pleurotus ostritus, oyster mushrooms, on bundles of wheat straw in his hog shed. Heinrich had documented the process in careful detail, 4 pages of it, with a pencil diagram of the sack arrangement and noted temperatures in both Fahrenheit and Celsius. What Joseph had told Heinrich, and what Heinrich had written in underlined capital letters at the bottom of page 49, was this: "Drought straw is better than good straw. Less competing organisms, cleaner substrate. Joseph says his best years followed dry summers." Raymond had read a 1957 extension bulletin from Kansas State that described oyster mushroom cultivation as economically impractical for American producers. The bulletin had not been wrong about the markets in 1957, but it was not 1957. There were restaurants in Wichita he'd noticed, in 2 trips for parts and once for Agnes's last specialist appointment, with chalkboard menus listing items he did not recognize, written in chalk in the way that indicated they changed often and sold. The extension bulletin had never tested drought straw. Joseph Bresny had. The gap between those 2 things was 47 years and 4 pages of notes on a shelf above a workbench in Elk County, Kansas. Raymond read the 4 pages twice. Then he walked back to the farmhouse and found the back of a 3-year-old seed catalog, where a small print listing for Sylvan Spawn Laboratory in Landysville, Pennsylvania advertised oyster mushroom spawn for mail order. He wrote them a check for $52 and mailed it that Monday. He did not tell Roy Decker. He did not tell David. He did not call Elk County Federal Savings. The spawn arrived in a brown cardboard box on November 4th, 1983. 2-quart jars of grain colonized with white Pleurotus ostreatus mycelium, packed in newspaper and labeled with printed instructions in small type. Raymond read the instructions twice at the kitchen table, then set them beside Heinrich's notebook and compared temperature ranges line by line. Joseph Bresny's numbers and Sylvan's numbers fell within 2 degrees of each other across the board. He spent the first 2 weeks of November preparing the hog confinement building. It had not housed hogs since 1974. 40 feet wide, 80 feet long, concrete floor, metal siding on a wooden frame, 2 ventilation windows per side. Raymond replaced the window hardware, swept the floor 3 times, and sprayed the walls with a diluted bleach solution he mixed in a 5-gallon bucket. He built shelving along both interior walls from salvaged 2x4s and plywood sheets pulled from the granary, 12 feet on each side, 3 tiers high. He ordered misting nozzles from a greenhouse supply catalog out of Salina, $47.50 for 6 nozzles and the fittings. He plumbed them to the water line that had served the hog waterers, running 1/2-inch copper pipe along the ceiling joists with a pipe bender he'd owned since 1962. The pasteurization vessel was already there. Heinrich's 250-gallon galvanized steel scalding tank, built in 1940 for hog slaughter and set on a concrete pad 20 feet from the barn's east wall, had stood unused for 9 years. Raymond mounted 2 salvaged propane burners underneath it and connected them to a 100-pound cylinder. The tank held enough straw, loosely packed in burlap sacks, for 1 full batch per cycle. His process derived from Joseph's 4 pages and adjusted through experiment. 1 day soaking the chopped straw in cold water with a cup of hydrated lime. 1 day pasteurizing at 165 degrees Fahrenheit for 90 minutes in the tank. 1 day cooling to 72 degrees before pressing spawn between the straw layers inside tied burlap sacks. The sacks went on the shelves. The misting nozzles ran 45 seconds every 4 hours. First batch, November 12, 1983. 12 burlap sacks, each holding 20 pounds of pasteurized straw. The 1954 Oliver 88 moved the wheat straw bales from the north field in December, 2 at a time on the front loader, its green paint chalky on the hood from 30 years of sun, but its engine pulling clean in the 17-degree mornings. Heinrich had bought the tractor new that year for $2,200. Raymond had rebuilt its carburetor in 1971, replaced the hydraulic seals in 1979, and changed the oil every 150 hours by the log he kept on the inside cover of the maintenance book hanging from a nail inside the barn door. The Oliver ran the way well-maintained things run, without drama, without complaint, exactly as needed. On December 18th, Raymond drove to Webb's for hydraulic fluid, and Roy Decker was there again, this time with 2 men from the church congregation. Roy had heard Raymond was running propane heat at the old scalding tank. "What are you cooking out there, Raymond?" one of the men said. "Straw," Raymond said. There was a pause that came close to respectful, then didn't quite arrive. "Straw," Roy said. Raymond paid for his fluid, drove home in 14 minutes, and checked the temperature in the hog building. The mycelium in batch 1 had spread 2 inches from the inoculation points. White, cottony, even. He noted it in Heinrich's notebook with a pencil and went inside for supper. In early February 1984, Raymond opened the hog building at 6 in the morning and found a green mold. He would not learn the genus until later, but it was Trichoderma, a fast colonizing competitor that outraces oyster mycelium when the substrate is not pasteurized cleanly, across 7 sacks in the second batch. The green was vivid and wrong, the color of something already lost. He pulled all 7 sacks before breakfast and incinerated them behind the granary in 20 minutes. He sat in the barn with Heinrich's notebook. Joseph Bresny had mentioned it on page 50, briefly. His early losses to green mold stopped when he extended the first cold soak by half an hour and lowered his pasteurization temperature from 180 degrees to 165. Raymond had been running the soak cold, not warm. He had not been reducing temperature during the soak phase before scaling to the boil. He rebuilt the second batch from new straw, soaked at 150 degrees for 2 hours, pasteurized at 165 degrees for 90 minutes. The difference was 12 degrees in the soak and 30 additional minutes of controlled heat transfer. He lost 11 days and an estimated 320 pounds of potential yield. He did not lose the batch again. The remaining 5 sacks from batch 1 produced their first full flush on February 3rd. 38 pounds of oyster mushrooms, firm and pale gray, smelling of anise and wet wood in the cold building at 7 in the morning. Raymond pressed the cap of one gently with 2 fingers, the same pressure he used to test soil resistance for planting depth, checking firmness against Heinrich's notes, which described a ready mushroom as one that resisted slight pressure without giving. He set it in the harvest box. He drove to Wichita that afternoon with 34 pounds packed in waxed cardboard boxes in the truck bed. He had eaten 4 pounds himself with butter and bread at the kitchen table before leaving. He'd identified 2 restaurants on previous trips. He walked into the first one, a place on Douglas Avenue called Andover Kitchen, at 3:15 in the afternoon and asked for the head cook. The cook came out, looked at the box, lifted 1 mushroom and smelled it, and offered Raymond $4.25 per pound for everything Raymond could bring on a weekly schedule. Raymond drove home in the dark. He stopped once on the highway, engine running, and looked at the sky for a moment through the windshield. Then he drove the rest of the way home. By July 1984, Raymond had completed 8 batch cycles and delivered 4,280 pounds of oyster mushrooms to Andover Kitchen and a second Wichita restaurant he'd added in March. Gross revenue, $18,190. After spawn, propane, and supply costs of $1,380, the net totaled $16,810. He had made 3 loan payments on time. In late July, he called David in Wichita and stated the numbers without preface. David was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Dad, do you need help with the building?" Raymond said he could manage. On August 8, 1984, Elk County Federal Savings delivered a notice of intent to accelerate Raymond's loan, a preliminary foreclosure document citing a technical default. Raymond had not submitted a projected crop income statement as required by Section 4.2 of his 1981 loan agreement. He had filed a partial harvest report in March, but had not included projected mushroom income, because the mushroom operation had not existed when the loan terms were written. The bank demanded cure within 30 days or repayment of the full $78,000 note. Raymond drove to Howard and retained an attorney named Frank Hess, who charged $150 for an initial consultation and identified two problems with the acceleration notice. First, the bank's own modification policy, the policy Schrader had cited in October 1983 to deny Raymond's request, required the institution to make a documented good faith effort at workout before accelerating. The bank had no such documentation. Second, Hess had seen a similar acceleration notice from Elk County Federal Savings on 3 other agricultural accounts in the county in the previous 18 months. Hess filed a written response citing the Kansas Agricultural Loan Modification Act on September 4, 1984. He also filed a formal complaint with the Kansas State Bank Commissioner's Office documenting the Rotary Club disclosure of Raymond's confidential loan information. The acceleration notice withdrew on September 19. Schrader did not contact Raymond directly. Raymond returned to the hog building. He expanded to 28 active sacks per batch cycle and added a weekly delivery to a restaurant in El Dorado, 40 miles west. If you find this kind of story worth your time, a subscribe costs you nothing. By October 1985, Raymond ran the hog building at capacity, 40 sacks per batch, 4 batch cycles staggered on a 12-day schedule, continuous harvest. Merle Hutchins, his neighbor and a retired hog farmer, had been arriving Tuesday and Thursday mornings since the previous spring to help with harvest and packing. Merle was 71, moved deliberately, and said very little. He understood how to pack a waxed box without bruising the caps. One Tuesday morning in November 1985, Raymond tallied the gross receipts in the spiral ledger he kept beside Heinrich's notebook on the barn shelf. He set his pencil down and sat with the number at the bottom of the column. Total sales from first delivery in February 1984 through November 1985, $64,400. The 1983 wheat crop, at its projected full yield and market price, would have brought $14,210. He turned the ledger to face Merle without comment. Merle looked at the figure. He set down the packing box he'd been loading, put both hands in his coat pockets, and looked out the building's open door at the north field. Heinrich would have wanted to know this worked, Merle said. Raymond wrote the figure in the margin of Heinrich's notebook. Then they both went back to work. By July 1986, the cumulative total reached $148,000. $3 years and 8 months of operation, 10 4/10 times what the 1983 wheat crop would have yielded if the drought had never arrived. Word traveled the way word travels in a town of 1,200 people. Not through newspapers, not through any channel that could be cited or measured, but through a remark at the feed store that reached someone's wife, who mentioned it to someone's husband, who repeated it incorrectly, and had it corrected by a third party who had seen Raymond's delivery invoices through an acquaintance in Wichita. The number passed through the county the way weather moves, shapelessly, in pieces, arriving at each person slightly different than it had left the last. Roy Decker heard a version of the number in September 1986 at Webb's. He heard $140,000. He told the man beside him that was impossible. He drove to Raymond's farm 4 days later. Raymond was running a batch cycle when Roy's truck came up the drive. Raymond walked Roy to the hog building without speaking and pulled open the door. 40 burlap sacks hung and stacked in the interior, half lit by 2 work lights, white mycelium visible through the burlap mesh. A dozen sacks already showing gray-brown pins pushing through the cut slits. The smell was damp wood and something almost sweet, like a forest floor after rain on a warm afternoon. The air temperature held at 68 degrees. The misting nozzles released a 4-second cycle from the ceiling, and the fine spray caught the light and fell. Roy stood in the doorway and did not speak for a long time. "How long did you know this was going to work?" Roy said. "I didn't," Raymond said. "I knew Joseph Bresney's numbers were right." Roy did not ask who Joseph Bresney was. He stood there another minute, looking at the sacks. Then he said, "I was wrong about this." He said it toward the shelving, not toward Raymond. Raymond nodded once. He went back to the batch. In March 1986, the Kansas State Bank Commissioner's office completed its examination of Elk County federal savings and issued a letter of finding. The bank received a formal citation for improper disclosure of confidential borrower information and a documented pattern of premature loan acceleration in agricultural accounts. The institution was ordered to implement new written procedures for modification requests and to notify affected borrowers of their right to review their files. Dale Schrader was passed over for the branch manager position that opened in May 1986. The bank's president, in a meeting Raymond later heard described through Frank Hess, cited the commissioner's findings directly in explaining the decision. Schrader sent Raymond a brief handwritten note in June 1986. It said, "I handled the modification request improperly and should have worked differently with your account. I apologize for the rotary disclosure." Raymond kept the note in the back of Heinrich's notebook, folded once. He did not respond to it. 2 neighboring farmers applied the method in 1986. Carl Bauer, who farmed 200 acres 4 miles east of Raymond's property, converted his machine shed in October and ran his first batch cycle using 18 tons of drought straw from his own failed summer crop. By the following July, Carl had grossed $22,000. He called Raymond twice for technical guidance. Raymond answered both calls, gave specific numbers, temperature, timing, spawn ratio per pound of substrate, and said nothing beyond that. A Sedgwick County soil conservation technician named Patricia Owens read a brief item about Raymond's operation in the Wichita Eagle in November 1986. 8 inches of type in the agricultural section. buried between a report on irrigation easements and a notice about winter wheat variety trials. She contacted Raymond through the county extension office and asked whether she could observe the operation for a program she was developing for drought-affected farms across 3 southeastern Kansas counties. Raymond let her observe for 2 days. She brought a notepad but no camera. She asked, on the second afternoon, about the contamination recovery, the specific moment in February 1984, when half the batch showed green mold and Raymond rebuilt it from scratch. He described the temperature adjustment, the extended soak, the source in Heinrich's notebook. She wrote it down without embellishment. In the spring of 1987, Dr. Glenn Hartley, extension specialist in agricultural economics at Kansas State University, published a revised bulletin on specialty mushroom production. The 1983 bulletin had stated that oyster mushroom cultivation was economically impractical for most Kansas producers, given limited regional market infrastructure. The 1987 revision cited, without using Raymond's name, a documented southeastern Kansas operation achieving sustained annual gross revenues between $65,000 and $80,000 on straw substrate derived from failed or low-yield grain crops. The appendix included pasteurization parameters, spawn sourcing details, and a specific note, the first time it appeared in formal extension literature, on the microbial advantage of drought-stressed wheat straw as a cultivation substrate. Less residual moisture, fewer competing organisms. Cleaner colonization. Joseph Bresney's insight, told to Heinrich Voss in 1936, now printed and mailed to 2,400 Kansas extension offices and agricultural lenders. Hartley had been wrong in writing. He corrected it in writing. That was what the correction cost him, and it was exactly what it should have cost. Raymond heard about the bulletin from Patricia Owens. He sat at the kitchen table and read it once. The pasteurization parameters were precisely correct. He set the bulletin on the shelf beside Heinrich's notebook and did not contact Dr. Hartley, did not call the Wichita Eagle, and did not respond when a television station from Wichita called the extension office asking for the southeastern Kansas producer's contact information. The extension office did not have it on file. Raymond continued delivering to Wichita twice weekly, packing waxed boxes in the dark before 5:00 a.m. with Merle's help on Tuesdays and Thursdays. If stories like this are worth something to you, subscribe. There are more of them. In April 1994, Raymond was 74 years old and walked the property slowly, his left knee carrying enough arthritis that he descended stairs one at a time and did not spend long on uneven ground. But he had not altered the maintenance schedule for the Oliver 88, and he had not changed the oil intervals documented in the log inside the barn door. David had come back to the farm in 1990 at age 31, after 6 years working a drafting job in Wichita. He'd learned the mushroom operation over 18 months the same way he'd learned everything agricultural, by following Raymond through the process in silence until he could run it without instruction. One April morning, David loaded the Oliver to move a fresh batch of baled straw from the field. He stopped at the tractor, engine idling, and looked at it for a moment. The machine was 40 years old that spring. Every trace of original green paint on the hood had faded to a chalky gray-green, but the engine fired on the first compression stroke, and the hydraulics moved the loader without hesitation. He said, "Dad, why don't we get a newer loader tractor, something with an enclosed cab?" Raymond stood at the scalding tank with the propane valve fittings. He looked at the Oliver without turning his full body, the slight sideward attention he gave to anything he was assessing. He said, "That tractor never failed me when I needed it not to fail me. I know every hour it's run and every repair that's been made to it. I have the documentation going back to 1954. I don't know that about a newer machine." David let it sit. He drove the Oliver to the field. That evening, Raymond sat at the kitchen table and passed Heinrich's notebook to David, not as a formal gesture, not with ceremony, but because David had asked the previous week about the first soak temperature, and the answer was in the notebook, and Raymond wanted him to read the source directly. David read pages 47 through 51, including Joseph Bresny's pencil diagram of the sack arrangement and Heinrich's underlined note about drought straw. He read slowly and without speaking. "A man from Moravia," he said finally. "Moravia," Raymond said. "Your grandfather spent 3 years talking with him once a week and wrote down everything he said. And you kept this notebook for 40 years. "I kept it," Raymond said. "I didn't know what I'd need." David turned to the back of the notebook, where Raymond's cumulative revenue figures occupied the margins in pencil, and where Schrader's folded note had rested for 8 years. He did not ask about the note. He read the revenue numbers in the margin: $18,190, $46,200, $83,600, the running totals adding to $148,000 and continuing beyond, and looked at them with the same steady attention Raymond brought to problems that required precision. He turned the pages back to Joseph Bresny's diagram. Then he set the notebook on the shelf beside the maintenance log for the Oliver, where it had always been. There is a photograph that David Voss keeps pinned to the wall inside the Hogg building, the Mushroom House, as the family calls it, taken sometime in the autumn of 1985 by Merle Hutchins with a Kodak Instamatic. In it, Raymond stands in the doorway of the building holding a waxed cardboard box, looking not at the camera, but back into the building at the rows of hanging sacks. The photograph is slightly overexposed, the way photographs were in those years when flat light hit concrete and the meter could not decide. The Oliver 88 sits behind the newer equipment in the barn now, its maintenance log still hanging from the nail inside the barn door, the last entry in Raymond's handwriting dated March 1999. It still starts. David starts it in April and October, not because the farm requires it, but because Raymond maintained things that worked and David maintained the practice of maintaining them. The drought of 1983 killed Raymond's wheat and left 90 tons of straw in the north field of a 160-acre farm in Elk County, Kansas. That straw was not a loss. It was substrate. The only thing separating those two facts was Joseph Bresny's knowledge, written into a composition notebook in 1936, kept on a shelf for 40 years, and opened by a man who had run out of other choices and who understood, when he read it, that his father had never discarded anything without reason. The 1983 drought took from Raymond Voss precisely what it needed to take to show him what had already been there. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it.